I grew up playing arena shooters, and if you were a gamer in the 90s and early 2000s, you might remember playing games like Quake, Unreal Tournament, and Doom. These games were some of the most popular and influential first-person shooters of all time, and they were my introduction to the shooter genre. Yet, over the years, their popularity took a back seat to different FPS concepts. Today, I want to explore the golden era of arena shooters, what made them great, and why they fell out of favor, and whether or not they could make a comeback, as many developers have tried and failed, some very recently. Now, the arena shooters back in the 90s and early 2000s were known for their fast-paced gameplay, futuristic and often bizarre weapons, and their competitive modes. Games like Quake 3 and Unreal Tournament were some of the most iconic games in this genre, and they really helped shape the first-person shooter landscape for years to come. One of the defining features of the arena shooter was their emphasis on movement mechanics. Unlike many modern first-person shooter games that rely heavily on cover-based shooting and slower gameplay, arena shooters feature a lightning-fast movement and acrobatic jumps. Players could strafe and dodge incoming projectiles and even jump to advantageous positions mid-firefight. Jump pads and rocket jumping allowed skilled players to take their movement skills to the next level. Now, another hallmark of these games was their crazy weapon design. They featured a wide variety of futuristic weapons, from burst fire rocket launchers to railguns, plasma rifles, goo guns, beam weapons, and even tactical nuke launchers. These weapons were often devastatingly powerful, turning your opponents into piles of body parts, but they also required a lot of skill and precision to use effectively. Now, without question, one of the most appealing aspects of the arena shooter back in the day was the ability to play against other people on the internet. That's right, in the late 90s and early 2000s, the internet was still in its early stages, and online multiplayer was a relatively new concept. Couch co-op or LAN parties were generally how you played games against your friends back in the day. LAN, a local area network, meant people basically hauled their PCs and crazy heavy CRT monitors over to their friend's house, plugged them into the same switch or router, and hoped the fuse didn't blow when everyone booted up. Then you could play against each other on your computers. Kinda crazy. And FYI, a fuse almost always tripped, just in case you were wondering. However, with arena shooters, if you had a nice dial-up or even the insanely expensive DSL setup, you could connect to the World Wide Web and play arena shooters with a low ping of 300 milliseconds. And I'm just ballparking that number there, but I do remember back in the day thinking 300 ping was pretty darn playable. And arena shooters quickly became some of the most popular multiplayer games because of this online functionality. Players could join servers and compete against each other in intense deathmatch battles, capture the flag matches, and other kinda goofy game modes. The arena shooters basically created the demand for online competitive FPS gaming, and they were also some of the only multiplayer FPS games that were developed by big studios at the time. However, their popularity began to wane as other variations on the multiplayer FPS began to take root, starting in the mod scene and eventually with big studios. The rise of more realistic and cinematic first-person shooter games such as Counter-Strike, Call of Duty, and Battlefield opened up the multiplayer shooter to people interested in something that felt a bit more grounded. 2003's Call of Duty emphasized very realistic graphics for the time, well-known real-world weapons, immersive storylines, and more tactical gameplay. Players were often tasked with completing objectives or working as part of a team, rather than simply trying to kill as many enemies as possible and send their body parts flying around an arena. Comparing this to the arena shooter, where a story was generally non-existent, this took gamers to a new plateau of immersion. Now, the declining popularity of the arena shooter can also be attributed to a lack of innovation in the genre. While games like Quake and Unreal Tournament were innovative and groundbreaking when they first released, subsequent releases in the genre failed to bring much new to the table other than improved graphics and kinda wonky vehicles. I remember when Unreal Tournament 3 released, thinking how just amazing the game looked, and then quickly dropping it to go back and play some Battlefield. Now, despite the decline of the arena shooter over the years, there's still some diehard fans who continue to play and love these games, and in recent years there have even been some new releases that have tried to bring back the arena shooter genre, such as Quake Champions and Splitgate. And while these games certainly haven't achieved the same level of success as their predecessors, they have shown that there is still some demand for this type of gameplay. One game that had recently gained a lot of attention is Splitgate. Splitgate is a newer arena shooter that could be described as a combination of Halo and Portal. It features fast-paced gameplay, futuristic weapons, and player-controlled portals that can be used to outmaneuver an opponent. The game had been in beta for several years, but it recently exploded in popularity thanks in part to popular Twitch streamers and YouTubers who started to play it and kind of showcase it. In fact, it became so popular that the servers were actually overwhelmed and the developers had to take the game offline temporarily to upgrade their infrastructure. This success showed that there is still a lot of fun to be had in the arena shooter genre. I certainly played Splitgate for a bit and it definitely brought me back to the old days of FPS gaming. Sadly though, Splitgate was also a great example of a flash in a pan. As fast as the game exploded in popularity, players seemed to abandon it just as quickly. Hitting over 67,000 concurrent players at its peak, it only took 3 months before the player base had waned down to only 5,000 peak players, and today it actually sits at closer to around 500 peak players. Now, there was another major emphasis to revive the arena shooter with a larger emphasis on team play, and that was 2017's Lawbreakers. Designed by Cliff Bleszinski, one of the lead minds behind Unreal Tournament back in the day, Lawbreakers launched with very impressive visuals and unique character mechanics. But it did also suffer from somewhat obscure game modes and frankly a much too large paywall to get into play. I would argue that the actual business model of the game killed it before it even had a chance to see if it was going to catch on. Now honestly, it is hard to imagine a classic take on the arena shooter really having a chance at making a comeback. Modern games seem to offer just too much excitement and variety with their gameplay. Splitgate is probably the best example of the public truly giving the arena shooter a try and then getting bored and moving on. Halo is often thought of as the modern take on the arena shooter, and even that is having a hard time maintaining an ample player base, which is kind of crazy considering that the multiplayer is free and it also has a really powerful mode and map editor built in to essentially give players unlimited amount of content as long as they're going to make it. Unfortunately, the arena shooter will probably be best remembered as just a stepping stone to bigger concepts. It was absolutely fantastic for its time, and I have many fond memories of playing Unreal Tournament at LAN parties and shouting across the room at my friends, but simply the advancements in tech and the increase in budget of games has allowed devs to evolve the shooter concepts much further than the arena shooter. And many of the movement mechanics and level design cues have been carried over into other games. Overwatch, for example, replicates many of the arena shooter movement skills and injects it with deep teamwork and engaging modes. It could also be argued that the arena shooter had a much higher skill ceiling in many regards compared to most modern shooters today. It's possible that this high level of skill made the games less inviting to casual players. Even now, when a game tries to put too much emphasis on movement mechanics, it seems like there's a faster drop-off rate with players, especially if there aren't any characters or gameplay styles that cater to the specific way that they want to play. All that said, I don't think there's any one simple reason as to why the arena shooter died. It was just a kind of outdated genre that the industry evolved from. But it does seem like it's probably not coming back, at least not like it was before. The game industry has basically had about 20 years to distill the FPS experience from the arena shooter and hone in on the quality that most players seem to want, and the arena shooter just can't compete with that. At least all the attempts to revive the genre have fallen short. I'd be curious to hear what you think. Do you think the arena shooter may have another day in the limelight, or was Splitgate basically as close to a comeback that we'll ever see? Also, how many of you grew up on the arena shooter, or was it already past its prime by the time that you got into FPS gaming? Let me know in the comments, and check out this video next, showcasing many of the features that were invented but later forgotten within the Battlefield franchise. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time. This is LevelCap, signing off.